right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a replenishing break. I am delighted to introduce our next presenters. We have Amanda Bowman and Amy Pierce. I have had the privilege of working with both Amanda and Amy on several collaborative projects, and they're truly wonderful individuals. And not only are they experts in their fields, but they're also genuinely kind, compassionate, and they both possess a fantastic sense of humor. It really is a testament to a strong working relationship when you can share laughter and joy while achieving great work together. And that's how I always feel when I get a chance to work with you, Amy and Amanda. So today's presentation, Finding Connections When Realities Don't Match, will delve into the common challenges providers face when supporting people who see, hear, and otherwise experiencing things differently from those around them. Amanda and Amy will draw on their personal and professional experiences to address this challenge and offer insights on staying connected with both yourself and those that you support. Amanda and Amy, it's so wonderful to have you here today. Amanda, you can go ahead and take control of your slides to advance them.
Thank you for your kind words, Jennifer. I'm going to invite Amy to get us started today.
I can totally do that. First and foremost, we're just really glad to be here, and you don't know what type of a privilege it is to be able to be and have these conversations that we're having. My name is Amy Pierce, and I am the Associate Manager, the Recovery Institute Associate Manager at Via Hope. I never remember my titles. One day I'll get my titles right, and it doesn't matter, because the essence of all of that is I get the privilege and honor of working with organizations across Texas currently in implementing recovery-oriented change projects. Specifically, even being able to work with organizations as they're implementing first episode psychosis projects as well. My background stems from, I've worked nationally, internationally with organizations in not only implementing recovery-oriented change projects, but also implementing peer services in many different ways. I came to this work, I always say, kind of from a roundabout way, in this essence that by the time I was 24, I'd been hospitalized between 40 and 50 times, my longest hospitalization being a full year at the state hospital. And it was through that and those experiences that I ended up working at the same state hospital I've been hospitalized at for a year, and starting the first peer support program in the state hospital system here in Texas. And it created this space within me where I got to connect this place of understanding, knowing, in a unique way of viewing things, and being able to support others as they navigated their own journeys, but also support systems as they made change to more recovery-oriented systems of care. And it was through some of these different projects that I actually got the opportunity to meet Amanda. And I'm really excited to be presenting with her here today.
Thank you. Great. You all, I am presenting from Austin, Texas today, where we've had a lot of rain and everything is growing and it looks beautiful, and we've got mold. So I sound sick, but I feel fine. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So I'll be sipping on some warm tea as we have these conversations in the next hour. As Amy said, my background has been more clinical in nature. Amy and I have had that unique partnership of the clinical and the peer specialist working together to learn from each other and do systems change work for the past decade. And prior to doing the systems change work, I worked at Austin State Hospital for 13 years. So that's my professional background. And what really got me into this work was that I had some personal lived experience with a life disruption due to mental health challenges. That experience was not in the public system, but it was a significant life disruption that I learned a lot from, and really informed a lot of the passion that I still hold today. And working with Amy and in the recovery movement has really helped me understand how to tap into that lived experience. And, you know, I really have come to identify as a clinician using her lived experience to spark a lot of that change that we want to see in the system. So I'm honored to be invited to join Amy today to talk to you all a little bit about what we've discovered are some of those common challenges when you're engaging with people who are having a very different, you know, experience than you are when you're trying to partner with them and move forward in a meaningful way. So here we go. An hour is not very long. And Amy and I always try to pack it in. Okay, so we are going to focus on promoting trust and partnership, particularly during a time when the person that you're trying to support is experiencing extreme distress, because we found that can be really challenging. The second goal, excuse me, of our short session is really looking at what should be avoided, because I think that's an easy thing to do. I think everybody who's joining us today probably can immediately think of things that, you know, they've done or they've seen other people done. We've all failed forward, right, in some important ways. So looking at some of those must not do's. And then thirdly, I think we all know that the system requires us to get certain things done in order to support people. And so what are some approaches that help us get our job done in service of helping people when that individual isn't in a state of mind to really be focused and participate on those concrete tasks? So those are sort of the things that we thought we might try to touch on the most today with you. Okay, great. So what we'd like to do is have you all tell us a little bit about the challenges that you're running into. And this is meant to be sort of a two-parter. So we're just going to do number one first. If you would share with us in the chat box, in general, what comes to mind when you think of the biggest challenges for service providers when you are supporting people who are experiencing psychosis? And we'll get to number two in a minute, but just take a minute and type in, what are those biggest challenges? Maybe it's within the relationship in the moment, or maybe it's the biggest challenges that those individuals are facing. But just what comes to mind broadly? We'll give everybody just a minute here. It's always interesting to see. We have so many people together at the same time. We can't not gather some data here. Okay, and let's all take a minute and look back. What are the themes that are coming out? So we've got building trust and rapport seems to be a theme. Finding that agreement to a path forward, agreement to services. There's a lot about the relationship I see, right? Mm-hmm. Connection. I see stigma a few times.
That's that
engagement. Mm-hmm. Risk for harm, that definitely comes up a lot, right? You're really thinking about, we all know as providers that, you know, that's certainly at the top of our ethics, you know, our duties is to assess for that. So thank you. Oh my gosh, we have so many here. We're going to do a little data analysis after the session. Okay, now let's look at number two. So specifically thinking about when you're encountering when you have an encounter with a person who is experiencing psychosis, and you've got these time-sensitive job requirements, like let's say the individual has stated that they want access to this program, right? And you've got to complete the paperwork, the eligibility paperwork, let's say, something like that. What kind of barriers do you encounter in those types of situations? Great, thanks, Sam. Sam just put in there the invitation. Okay, and we're seeing things like motivation, lack of attention span, and then we're also seeing some systems barriers. So I really appreciate you all who are taking that systems perspective. So wait lists, right? Yes. Oh, somebody here is saying they're missing in action. You can't find them. That is so true, right? How many ACT teams are out there looking for people right now, just trying to find and follow up with people? Yes, staffing difficulties, right? We all know that staff retention is a huge issue. So thank you for taking a minute, and we'll continue to look at these and try to incorporate and address some of these, but I also think some of this information will be great to address later by the first episode psychosis team. So thank you for doing that. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. So we just wanted to acknowledge that it's always a theme that communication, during a period when someone is experiencing things that we have labeled psychosis, right? These are some of the things that we tend to see as supporters from the outside, right? And these are some of the things that you all named, right? They might be distracted. They might have beliefs that we don't share. They might change topics very quickly, right? So this is kind of obvious. And this is one of our first resources that we're going to refer you to, and there's another list that might be helpful. But I want to turn it over to Amy, and we're going to offer another way to kind of think about what psychosis is. I'm sure we all are here because we have some exposure and we work with this population. So Sam, if you would advance the slide for us, and Amy's going to talk about another couple of ways to think about what psychosis is and how it shows up.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. There are so many different definitions, and I even looked at Webster's definition. I looked at a number of different things when you hear that word psychosis. And this is from an article from NIH. And I loved in this article because one of the things, as a person who hears and sees things that others don't as well, I'm always looking for language to express and explain those experiences. I'm always looking for language, and mostly it's on that reflecting back. And even though I have experiences today, I'm always kind of going like, how do I put words to this? Now, as you can see on the screen, there is a definition, and it goes in to say psychosis is characterized by symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. We hear those words all the time. The nature of these symptoms makes psychosis the most ineffable, I don't know how to say that word, experience of mental disorder. Extremely difficult for affected persons to comprehend and communicate. And I think for me, when we start thinking about and looking at communication in relation to persons who are navigating, hearing, and seeing things that others don't, or having these really intense experiences, it's to look at the other piece where sometimes it can be extremely difficult for that person to get out what they want to say, what they want you to hear, what they want to express. And so an individual said, there are things that happen to me that I have never found words for. Some are lost now, some which I still search desperately to explain, as if time is running out, and what I see and feel will be lost to the depths of chaos forever. If you remember on that slide just before, it showed about some of the difficulties around communication. And it can be a person's talking so fast and so rapidly and changing and changing and changing. And for me, in my experience, so often when that occurs and that shows up, what this quote says and states is usually what's happening. If I don't get it out right now, I'm not going to find it. If I don't get it out right now, I'm not going to be able to have you be able to hear it or understand it, or I will forget it. Because my biggest fear is someone who has these experiences that I'm always going to go into the depths of that black hole and not come back out. And so something to think about. We go to the next slide. The more I try to speak, the less you understand me. And this is why we stop trying to communicate. I don't know if y'all have had the experience when working with someone where you're trying to communicate, they're trying to speak, and then all of a sudden everything just shuts down. And there's a point where I know for myself, and once again, I can only speak for myself, that I just become quiet. Because I don't know how to express, or I don't know how to explain, or I have fear going on. And once again, I love this way this is put. Not being able to communicate just my basic feelings, not identifying with another human being, not being able to like connect or feel like anybody understands me. And that feeling of being completely alone in my experience are killing me. And when I look at things and when I think about communication and looking at all the things people see outside, I always think it's such an important piece to think about, like what's happening internally, right? Why do people hide behind the couch? That was my thing with ACT team. I would always hide behind the couch. I did find out that they saw me jump behind the couch, so they at least knew that I was there for my ACT team worker years later. But like what's going on with underneath, and how do we, as persons working alongside individuals, connect to what's occurring for that person in the here and now in this moment, and hear them, the way in which they're able to communicate in this moment. So you can go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it back to Amanda.
We thought another way to start to address some of this is to talk about the myths and misconceptions. And I'm sure that many of you have seen some of this and are very familiar with this. So some of this is going to be quite familiar to you. So Sam, we'll go to the next slide. This is the most obvious one, right? As we start to tackle transitioning a more medical model, traditional system to a more recovery-oriented, model, is just realizing that we can't predict the future, right? There's been a lot of research interviewing people that have been living with what we would term, severe mental illness for many years. And we know now that when you meet someone who has severe impairment right now, that does not necessarily predict long-term disability. We know that 45 to 65% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia will recover from the disorder in the traditional sense of the word recover. Like they will return back to kind of, generally their former level of functioning. And for the other people, recovery in a different way of defining recovery is still very much possible. And that's the part I think that's hard for many providers to wrap their head around, right? Like, what is that new quality of life, that the new definition of recovery look like? And I know that I did a lot of damage early on as a new clinician working at Austin State Hospital, thinking that I was doing people a favor by telling family members that I knew people's future when their 18, 19, 20-year-old, had their first episode of psychosis, and I was preparing them for a completely different life. And I wish so much that I could go back and undo some of that, because I was being misled at the time that we knew what this diagnosis of schizophrenia meant for people's future. And, having worked with people like Amy and seeing the research now, I know that we absolutely cannot predict people's future, right? Sam, I'm going to give it a try. Yeah, here we go. Yes, it's working. This is another one that I find really interesting. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the way that it's talked about in the research is that oftentimes it's easy to assume that all domains of functioning are equally impaired. And so what I mean by this is, I think we've all seen this in people. You meet someone and it may really stand out that they are very impaired in this one area. They may even be displaying some very bizarre behaviors, right? And it's really easy to conclude that they are, completely incapacitated or completely impaired across their entire life. Surely this person can't work. Surely, they need help across their entire life. When oftentimes that's not the case. If you look a little bit more closely, you realize that they're extremely advanced in many of their other skills, right? And one quick example I have of this, just recently, we were doing some evaluation work where Amy and I and another colleague, we were traveling around Texas. We had the opportunity to interview people that are in a program. It's the Home and Community-Based Services Program for adults with mental health conditions. And it's for people who are specifically hospitalized and in and out of the system a lot, that they haven't been able to be, maintained in the community. And so they need extra support. And I met with a gentleman, and he told me that he likes to stay in touch with his daughter, and no matter how many times people have tried to teach him how to use a cell phone, he cannot use a cell phone. And he always has to go to the other residents in the supported living home when he needs to dial the cell phone. But then 2 minutes later, he's telling me a story about how the toilet in the supported living home got clogged and they were getting ready to call a plumber. And he said, why in the world would you call a plumber for a clogged toilet? Somebody run to the store and get me a snake tool and I can fix this. And what was amazing is that the staff at the home trusted him and they believed him when he said that he could do this, and he did it. And he got the toilet fixed within 30 minutes and he saved the home a lot of money. So, we have to listen to people and understand that, just because someone is having impairment in one area that really stands out to us doesn't mean that they're impaired across all domains. So that's another thing to really figure out. And I know, Amy, you have a great example from your own experience that you've told that we got on a recording one time about a time that you were able to work. Would you tell that story?
Yeah, I sure can. When I was I was placed on disability at 18. My hospitalization started when I was very young and was in the system at a very young age. And um, I went through things and navigated things, and I got to this point where I wanted to take the leap, and I'm gonna go work. I'm gonna go work at the state hospital, where I've been hospitalized, because I felt safe there. And when I went to work there, there was a lot of concern, and even to the point where I ended up leaving services because they were thinking that I was unwell again. But like there was a place in there where I had people who believed in me and that I could do this job. And because of that, I began to really believe in myself. It didn't mean that I was still not hearing and seeing things that others don't. It didn't mean that I didn't have times when things got worse. And I remember the first time I experienced one of the experiences that I have had a history of having when things are getting worse, which is often I will start seeing blood coming from the faucets. So all water within the house is blood. And that includes the shower, the faucet, anything with water. And for me, because of learning to live alongside the challenges that I've had and the way of navigating the world that I do, I've created different supports within my life that, allow me to like recognize this and have strategies. And with those strategies, one of the things is that I have 2 days I can't take a shower. And then after the second day I need to. And how I do it is I go in, take my glasses off, close my eyes. I turn the water really cool because it doesn't feel like anything. And I jump in, take a shower, wash my hair, and I jump out. And I was actively having these experiences at different times while I was working. Now, when I was working, at times, if I was not in a place to be able to support someone, I would do other types of work, which was paperwork, filing things, whatever. But I was still able to take care of myself in my own home. I was still able to pay my bills. I was still able to get up and go to work and be productive at work. Whereas years before, if that would have happened, I typically would have ended up in the hospital. And I say that just because for many persons who are navigating, experiencing, hearing, seeing things that others don't, everything doesn't go away. I've just learned how to like check things out. It's one of the beautiful things as a peer specialist is being able to support individuals in figuring out like how they are able to navigate those things when they do occur, but as well as just talk through it with other persons who are doing this work. And so just because that increase of symptoms, that increase of what would be symptomology happened, my life didn't stop again. And to this day, it doesn't stop. I just have actions I have to put into place. And thankfully, I've found persons in my life that I'm able to actually share with them without that fear of it being hospitalized, being judged, or being pathologized, just in connecting with me of that's got to be really tough. That's got to be really difficult. Like, so how do you navigate that? Right? So just some things to think about.
I love that story, Amy, because it illustrates how, as a professional, as a clinician, I can't stop when I just ask you about your symptoms, right? I have to ask you how your symptoms are impacting your life, like how you're navigating them. And then when we create those objectives on your plan, we can't just measure your symptoms. We have to measure your ability to take a shower, your ability to go to work, and I'm getting into the whole person-centered recovery planning thing, but it's like, that's why that's so important. We have to focus on your quality of life and your functioning. We can't just focus on the symptoms. The symptoms are just part of the story, So, okay, let's move on to the next one because I know we're running out of time here. So this is one of the ones that I think is so interesting, and we'll invite Amy to tell some of her best tidbits of her story. So this myth, okay, are delusions 100% false? So many of us professionals are taught that reality testing, right, is like the way to go. That if you can get somebody to accept, right, that they're delusional, then like you're golden. You're helping the person out, right? But let's take a look at that a little bit more closely, right? So Amy, you want to share a little bit about your story?
My fun stuff of the food. You know, once again,
Uh-huh.
everything I'm sharing is coming from being able to be on the other side of a lot of these things and really being able to look back, even though when they still come up, there's an awareness at times. One of the things that since I was fairly young that would happen when I would start becoming really unwell is it would start showing up kind of in a pattern. And one of those patterns included that my food was poisoned, right? There was nothing safe to eat. And I had to do these things. I had to freeze it. It had to be microwaved. And if it came into the house, it had to be wrapped in tin foil, which is just how I also wrapped my head in tin foil with my hat on the head so that people couldn't listen to me. But it was a very specific, because it was poison. This food was poison. But if I wrapped it in tin foil, brought it into the house, put it in the freezer, no matter what it was, froze it, took it from the freezer in tin foil and put it in the microwave, and then microwaved it, I could then eat it, right? And this would show up at different points in time in my life, and even still sometimes to this day shows up. And what was very interesting, probably about, how old am I, 50 now? It's been about 15, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to think about years. It's been about 15 years ago, I was actually in a conversation with someone and we were talking, and I actually found out that I actually have lots and lots of food allergies. And the impact that many foods have for me also impact my thinking and my mood. And so in reality, a lot of the foods that I were eating and I was eating actually was poison in a sense to my body and was causing like this high levels of inflammation. And so it just was a very interesting thing. And I can give you lots of examples from other persons who I've worked alongside as well as myself of how there's like these threads of things that are actually occurring within what shows up as a delusional belief or something that's a false belief. You're on mute, Amanda.
Thank you. Teamwork. There's been a lot of research done on this by our colleagues at Yale University, and we interviewed Dr. Let's get me to the next one. Oh, it's not advancing. Sam, will you advance for us? Thank you. Yeah, Larry Davidson at Yale University has done a lot of research looking at people experiencing psychosis. And let's hear what he has to say about kind of the emotional layer of people who are holding these very, very, very closely held beliefs that we see as false. Let's hear what he has to say.
I think of delusions in conjunction with a Yeats poem, where Yeats writes, tread carefully because you tread on my dreams. And I think we need to be fairly careful about delusions because often they're very much connected with very emotional, they have a lot of emotional salience for the person that we don't necessarily understand just from hearing the delusion. And I learned this many years ago when I was talking to a young man who was doing much better. He was in recovery at the time, but he'd been quite sick and had been hearing voices and was quite delusional for some time, and told me that he had been convinced he was a CIA operative, which is what his voices had told him. And this was during the Cold War, before the Soviet Union stopped being the Soviet Union. So he had a very important role in this thought broadcasting experiment for the CIA. And he said it wasn't until the 37th psychiatrist told him that he had schizophrenia and that the voices were a symptom of an illness that he thought maybe there's something to it. Maybe 37 people wouldn't tell me the same thing if maybe there's something to it. But he said it then took him 7 years to be convinced that they were telling him something that was true. And 7 years, why did it take you 7 years? And he said, well, if you had the choice of being a CIA operative or being a mental patient, which would you choose? Being a CIA operative gave him self-esteem, gave him a sense of purpose and meaning in life. He was a very important person. He had this mission. Being a mental patient is not exactly a source of self-esteem. So we should be careful when we start, messing around with people's beliefs, closely held beliefs, that they're representing something that's important to them that we need to better understand. And sometimes, most often people don't act on delusions. Most often. Sometimes they do, and that's very problematic. But most often people will say things like they're Jesus or they're Louis XIV, but they won't act like that. And in that case, what harm is it doing to allow them to believe it as we try to understand better what it's referring to?
So I think there's a number of things that we can take from that. I'm not taking that we should tell people 37 times. I'm taking the part that, there is meaning underneath the surface content, right? One of the ways that I have tended to explain delusions or false beliefs to family members as my explanation has evolved over the years is I kind of see it as a dreamlike state, but you're awake. And you may or may not remember, parts of it later on, like Amy said earlier. And when I think about that parallel between dreams and, what people experience during an altered state of reality, I believe that dreams also have meaning, but it's not always clear what that meaning is, right? Maybe until later on or until, the person develops that insight. So let's start to kind of look a little bit more closely at strategies. I think some of those are bubbling up to the surface here. We wanted to offer this resource to you, and we do have a slide at the end that has the links to these resources, and you'll get a copy of these slides. This is part of the mental health first aid program and resources. And this is a particular box that's in one of the handouts, and it's what not to do when responding to hallucinations or delusions. And there are some good things listed here, but I'd like to focus on this first one. It says, do not pretend to agree with the person's hallucinations or delusions, right? And I think we're taught a lot, right? Like, don't collude with the person's delusion. Don't pretend, right? But I think sometimes that gets blown out of proportion or misconstrued. I think that there is an emotional element and a very fundamental need that is very real for that person. And I think as Dr. Davidson was talking about, I think it can be very harmful to dismiss that fundamental need that is absolutely real for them, right? And typically the need that, I notice, and I'm curious if you all feel free to comment in the chat, typically it's fear, it's about safety, or it's a need to be recognized, right? It's some unmet need. And that unmet need, oftentimes you can connect it to things that you do know are true about their life. So I'm going to share one quick example. Again, it's just from my recent work. I feel like I can think of so many examples over the last 20 years, but here just recently, again, we're going around Texas interviewing people part of the HCBS program. And I was meeting with a gentleman, and the longer I talked to him, the more he became comfortable telling me about how focused he was and concerned he was about neighbors who were showing the sign of the Antichrist and had horns and had certain features. And he was really, really upset that other people living in the home were unbothered by this. And he was carrying this burden, and he was calling around. He was trying to build up, support. What are we going to do? And so, clearly I did not, he was pointing out the neighbors to me, and he was asking me, he wanted me to validate that I believed him. And I chose to focus on the fact that he felt, that safety was being threatened. He felt frustrated that other people weren't listening to him, and that must be extremely, extremely stressful to be carrying this burden, and such a big burden of like good versus evil for so long, without other people acknowledging it. And just saying that, he was like, thank you so much. Finally, somebody understands what I'm going through, that I'm holding this all on my own. I make phone calls. He had a log where he had been observing and writing down all the things that he had been seeing every day. So he didn't necessarily need me to confirm I believe the neighbors. And in fact, I told him, I don't see the signs of the Antichrist. I don't see what you're seeing. But what I do see is that I'm really concerned about that you're carrying this huge burden on your shoulders, right? And that's really what he seemed to need to hear from me. So I think that there are two realities, or two parts, right, of what we can respond to people. Yeah. Amy, do you have more that you want to say on this slide, or should we go to the next slide where we're going to look a little bit more at the supporting people?
Well, I think we can go on to the next one, but I do want to just make the point, and I think there was something even said in the chat where it says, do not ridicule the person even if what they're saying doesn't make sense to you or like make fun of.
Yeah.
Just because you may be in a state of upset or having experiences that others are not, doesn't mean that internally that doesn't get in here. I can still tell you a number of different circumstances where people thought I wasn't able to hear them, that I heard them word for word. And so I just think that's a really important thing to note, that even if we don't think a person's responding or has a level of clarity where they're able to experience or understand what's being said, and don't do that.
Yeah.
So, and let's talk about what you should do. How's that? Because I like the shoulds. Well, maybe not the shoulds, but one of the things that I found, and I think that have worked for me in my own working alongside persons, but also for myself, is just that talking in really clear, short sentences. And it says a calm, non-threatening voice. And I love what the previous presenter was saying, and she was talking in the relationship to self-compassion, but she said something, which is something, and she did share some type of like research kind of thing behind it, or philosophy behind it. And I just have Amy philosophy, if that makes sense. But as a person who has had those experiences where I couldn't always trust what I was thinking or hearing, I learned to trust what I felt. I learned to trust my environment. I learned to trust how you felt. If you were calm, like I learned to trust through feeling. I would also assert that probably my experience of feeling the world has been heightened and continues to be heightened because I check things out a lot that way. It's how I maybe even take a chance to somewhat trust you just a little bit, is if you feel safe, right? And so those places about talking clearly, short sentences, even if I'm talking in long sentences and around, but if you can just say things very short and clear, that's about all at times that I could hold on to, right? Or even like writing those bullet points down, or things that we need to accomplish or that need to happen. Because for some people, like there's times where the only way I would be able to take it in is if it was written, right? Or if I was able to sit there with you and write it myself, because my writing what you said helped me to understand what you were saying. And once again, all I know is these were things that worked for me, and in ways that I've supported others as well, and also supported other clinicians in working with people. And Amanda, you shared that place of empathy and empathetic about how a person feels about their beliefs and their experiences, and connecting with what you're seeing, that emotion, what you're seeing as their experience. You may not have a belief or have the same experience, but as human beings, we can connect about that distress, right? Or we can connect about that fear or that excitement. We don't have to have the same experience about what actually is occurring. And that kind of goes into the same other place. And I love that. One of the things that I've found, and I think that there's a beautiful way in which peer support and that, implementing and utilizing peer specialists within this first episode team, is there's this place where there's such a beauty of being able to draw out strengths from some of those experiences or frustrations that people have navigated, or pulling out those strengths from what a person's been through, to support them in building and taking those next steps in life. And listen. So often I know that each of you, and depending upon what role you're in, whether family member or clinician or administrator, there's things that you have to do, you have to accomplish. But if we can just sometimes take the extra time to listen, and listen to what a person's actually trying to say, a lot of times they answer our questions. It may not be as straight as Amanda asked me a question and I respond right now. But if we are able to create the time to listen for, many times we can pull out the information that we're needing, as well as then ask the person, is this what you're, is this truth for you? Or is this what you're wanting? There was a time that I worked with an individual who actually was my roommate when I was on the units at the hospital, but she was basically being put in seclusion or restraint almost like every day. And it was like a constant, and nobody on the unit could figure out what was going on, because she would go from things being okay to all of a sudden things were like 100, and she was trying to fight everyone. And they knew I'd had this prior relationship with her, and they were pretty much at the place where, can you just see if she'll talk with you? And I just went and sat with her on the floor in the seclusion room, and then stood with her, and we kind of walked around in a circle for a little bit in the room. And then eventually we kind of went out into the courtyard. And I just was kind of just asking a few things, but mostly letting her just talk. And I was sharing a bit, and then I was asking questions. And a long story really short, because it took about an hour to get there. But what was actually happening for her was that staff were actually trying to be really respectful, and they were calling her ma'am. So if they didn't know her name, they were coming on new, they would say, ma'am. And then that would start this whole world of upset. And then she would be talking and sharing that people are coming to get her, like all of this. What it boiled down to was, when she was in the community, a lot of times when she would get picked up by the police, they would say, ma'am. and she would get picked up by the police. She would either be taken to jail or she would be either taken to a hospital against her will. And so the word just ma'am was what was doing it. And as soon as got to that point, and so I just kind of asked some clarifying questions once I found it. And then I was able to share it with the other staff, and like they made sure people knew. And once that was stopped, she wasn't put in seclusion or restraint again during those days. And subsequent times when she was in there, it was very clear. And while that is an experience in the hospital specifically, but it just points out that place of listening, and that place of listening to and hearing from the way a person's trying to explain things, not expecting the communication to always be how we come into the conversation, expecting the conversation to be, if that makes any sense. I talk around things. I talk in a circle a little bit at times because I don't always have words for things. But just listening, people know if you listen, people know if you give them that time. But also, if you only have a short amount of time, letting people know that I have 5 minutes, I have 10 minutes is a very important key when we're looking at connecting and supporting persons who are navigating hearing and seeing things others don't, because there's something that happens when you have that clarity that can also create the space. Can see all the other things within this, but the one thing that I go to is, if a person doesn't want to talk to you, no matter what you have to get done, don't push it. You may create a time where you come back or check, a day later or even later that day, but don't push it in that moment, because there's a lot of worlds that can get created there. But also, if they change their mind, be open for that time and like step into that space. We were somewhere just recently working with an individual, and this gentleman was, at first, he was like, I'm not talking to anybody, I don't want to talk to you. He was really, really upset. And then 4 minutes later, he comes and sits down at the couch. And just that openness to meet him where he was in that moment, even though 4 minutes before he didn't want to talk, opened up a large conversation where we were able to get some of the information we needed for the work that we were doing. So being open to those possibilities. Treat everyone with respect, right? Treat persons you're working with respect. And it's okay to say to a person, if you're feeling concerned about your safety, to just say that.
Mhm.
That's actually very respectful. So often we get afraid of that. And just saying, I'm going to take a step back, just a little concern for my personal space. I want to hear what you're saying. And many times that can shift things, because I know for myself, a lot of times I don't even realize where I might be getting really loud, really forceful with things when I'm having these experiences. But as soon as someone kind of points it out for a second, I can shift.
Mhm.
And I think when you're looking at communicating and working alongside persons who are navigating hearing things and seeing things that others don't, being diagnosed with certain diagnoses that, as Amanda said years ago, I was told I'd never live on my own, I would never work, I would never be off a disability, I would never, is that we hold the space of hope for everyone, and hope for a place in a life that is of their choosing and what they can see possible, and that we actually come from a place where that there are expectations, and that we create opportunities, or if they're wanting to go for going back to work, even if we may not believe that is the right time or that they may fail, who are we to say? And we get the beautiful opportunity to support them and work with them along the way to put structures in place so that they can achieve whatever it is that they want. And I keep saying they, which is not something that I like to use, because as a human being, no matter if we hear things and see things that others don't, if we've been entrenched within the system, I believe beyond a doubt, I was so lucky as a young person having the supports that surrounded me early on, even though it wasn't a structured program, people created programs for me that, you know, by the time I was 25, that was my last hospitalization. Doesn't mean everything has gone away. It doesn't mean everything has shifted. It just means that little by little, I've learned to be able to create the life that I have today because of the supports I had, but most importantly, because people initially believed that I could. And so that, I think, is just the bottom line of what this is all about, is that place of hope. And I do want to just acknowledge one thing I learned is that oftentimes when you work with persons who have these extreme experiences, a lot of times you only see them when they're at their worst, or when they're only experiencing these extreme states. You don't always see them when they're outliving their life. So I'm here to tell you right here, right now, that there are so many people that you probably have touched within your lifetime, within your workspace, that are outliving incredible lives that you just don't get to see. So remember that when you're having some of those times of concern or when things get heavy, because what you do makes a huge difference. Says the person who's sitting on this chair before you at 50 now, off of disability, paying bills, owning my own home, all of these other things that people said that would never be the case because I had, diagnosis of schizophrenia and such. So thank you. It's wonderful. Thank y'all for having us.
Amy,
Yeah.
I'm going to drop a question in the chat right now. Okay, ready? Look.
I'm trying to look.
Do you see?
I'm getting to the
I'll
bottom.
read it to you. I'll read it to you. How do you encourage people to share when it involves assessing safety and the person is afraid people will think they're crazy or they're going to get sent back to the hospital?
That's a huge one. And I think that for many, many years, I was terrified of that. And I think it's kind of been my role as a peer specialist to kind of hopefully try to debunk some of those pieces and really have some open conversations with individuals where they're able to just feel that it's a safe place. And it's just that is to really saying that, there are certain places and, for me, telling people or asking people, like, I'd really like to know what's going on for you. And acknowledging if that fear is there around that the 𝐂𝐨𝐧𝐼𝐻 team is going to come out, or they're going to be involuntary committed, or if they say the word suicide, that someone's going to come. But having honest conversations and acknowledging that fear, but also taking the time to try to understand, I know what that word means to me. What does that mean for you right here, right now? Because for me, I would use suicide because that was the only word I knew to use when I was just really, really having a difficult time. It didn't always mean that I wanted to no longer be here on this earth. And so, like, that place of just supporting people in knowing that this space is a safe space, but also being honest. And just being honest along the way and saying that, right now I'm really concerned. This is what you're saying. This is what I'm seeing. And if there's places where you can give people options, giving them those options. But from the very beginning, also, when you're working with somebody, asking them if they're in the place where they can have the conversation, should this experience come up for you, or should you be in a place where you are feeling really unsafe? How would you like for me, or how would you like for me to have that conversation with you? And that's one of the things that I found probably works the best if you have that if you've had the time to create that relationship with someone. The other thing is just by being authentically yourself and just being honest, and if there is something that you're needing to take actions with, or needing to get further actions or bring someone else in, just letting them know step by step the why, and inviting them to be a part of that, and just acknowledging their upset or whatever's going on. Because it's not those are not easy conversations. Those are not easy spaces. And I think a lot of times as providers or persons working with people, we get really afraid when we hear certain words, but also as persons who are navigating that, we learn not to say certain words, because those certain words get you into the emergency room, right?
Right.
Or get
All
your
right, I think we're
emotions right.
over time,
Sorry.
Amy. I know I dumped a big question on you right there at the end. Thanks, everybody. If you don't know these resources, check them out.
Oh my goodness, Amanda, Amy, that was a terrific presentation. I have to just say, when you get a chance to peek at the chat box, Amy, your story is so impactful, and just so many positive words that have been shared. So I wanted to just name that. I want to thank the audience for your feedback during that presentation. Phenomenal, phenomenal work.